Welcome to this explainer. Okay, today we're breaking down something absolutely huge. We finally have a launch date for the debut of SpaceX's biggest rocket ever built, the Starship V3. Mark your calendars for May 19th, because anticipation for this one is literally through the roof. You know, Starship hasn't flown since that incredibly successful test flight back in October of 2025, and this upcoming mission, which is the mega rocket's 12th flight overall, is going to introduce a massive leap forward in its architecture. We're going to trace its exact blueprint and follow its path through a totally thrilling, high-stakes 65-minute flight test. Okay, let's dive right into this. 33. That is the staggering number of Raptor engines mounted on the bottom of the super heavy booster stage. Now, getting 36 immense rocket engines to ignite perfectly in unison, historically, that's been one of the absolute greatest challenges in all of rocketry. But thanks to some unbelievable new structural upgrades on version 3, which we're going to explore in a second, all 33 of these engines will now be able to start up simultaneously. It's a phenomenal feat of engineering, and it actually required an entirely new internal design.
Here's our roadmap for today's explainer. First, the Starship V3 upgrades, then stepping stones to deep space, followed by the flight plan and objectives. After that, we'll go through a step-by-step flight timeline and wrap up with splashdown and recovery.
All right, part 1, the Starship V3 upgrades. Now, what's really interesting here is that to appreciate the scale of version 3, we have to look at the massive physical changes SpaceX has actually made to this machine. If you contrast the old booster design with the V3 architecture, you'll immediately see cleaner, much stronger modifications. First off, look at the grid fins, those lattice-like structures at the top of the booster that steer it back to Earth. They've gone from 4 fins down to 3. But get this, those 3 are now 50% larger, significantly stronger, and feature entirely new catch points. They've also been physically lowered on the booster, which is super smart because it reduces their exposure to the extreme heat of the upper stage's engines during separation. Oh, and the hot stage ring, which connects the 2 halves of the rocket, it's now fully integrated right into the booster, meaning it won't be discarded during flight anymore. But hey, the changes aren't just on the outside. The internal plumbing has been completely overhauled too. I want to highlight this specific quote detailing the Super Heavy's redesigned internal hardware. It points out that the fuel transfer tube is now, quote, roughly the size of a Falcon 9 first stage. I mean, just let the sheer scale of that sink in for a second. We're talking about an internal pipe whose only job is to channel cryogenic fuel from the main tank down to the engines, and it's literally the size of an entire separate orbital rocket. It is almost comically massive. But this staggering redesign is exactly what allows all 33 Raptor engines to ignite simultaneously, and it enables way faster, more reliable flip maneuvers out in space. Moving on up, the upper stage, simply called the ship, has also received some massive upgrades. Basically, SpaceX performed what they call a clean sheet redesign of its propulsion system. In the aerospace world, that means they went completely back to the drawing board to wipe out past issues. This clean sheet brings us a brand new Raptor startup method, increased propellant tank volume, and a totally improved reaction control system, which, by the way, is absolutely vital for steering the ship in the vacuum of space. Crucially, these updates also drastically reduce the volume of contained spaces in the aft end of the vehicle. That heavily mitigates the risk of any trapped propellant leaks. So to sum it up, we've got a radically redesigned booster paired with a clean sheet upper stage. Moving on to part 2, stepping stones to deep space. When you look at the macro, long-term goals that these micro-engineering details are actually serving, well, the absolute most important capability this vehicle needs to master is off-Earth fuel transfer. By definition, this is the incredibly complex process of moving ultra-cold cryogenic propellant from one spacecraft to another while they're orbiting in space. Think about it. You simply cannot carry enough fuel all the way from Earth's surface to reach the Moon or Mars in one single go. You have to refill in orbit. And the V3 ship now explicitly sports brand new propellant feed connections built specifically to test and support this exact capability. So, the crucial point here is that these mechanical upgrades directly unlock humanity's future in deep space. Together, these elements enable a massive step change in what Starship can actually do. We're talking about unlocking its absolute core functions, achieving full and rapid reuse of the rocket, mastering that in-space propellant transfer we just talked about, deploying massive Starlink networks, and even orbital data centers, and ultimately sending human crews and heavy cargo to the lunar and Martian surfaces. All right, let's get into part 3, flight plan and objectives. We know what the rocket is built for, but what is it actually going to do today?
Well, the May 19th launch has a very specific, high-stakes to-do list for its 12th overall flight. First, the ship will fly an eastward suborbital trajectory. Then, while it's coasting up there in space, it must successfully deploy 22 dummy Starlink V2 satellites. It also needs to relight a single Raptor engine while in the vacuum of space. That is a completely vital maneuver for any future operational missions that need to return safely to Earth. And finally, it absolutely must capture clear diagnostic imagery of the ship's heat shield to inform future development.
Which brings us to part 4, step-by-step flight timeline. Let's see how this all builds, because once that countdown hits 0, the clock is ticking on a really fast-paced 65-minute flight. At exactly 0 minutes, we have liftoff from Starbase's brand new Pad 2, which, by the way, has been upgraded itself to fuel the rocket faster. Just 7 minutes into the flight, the booster's job is totally done and it's gonna splash down. Up in space, right at the 17.5-minute mark, the Starlink deployment sequence begins. It's a remarkably quick process, wrapping up exactly 10 minutes later at 27.5 minutes. Finally, at 65 minutes, the ship itself will re-enter the atmosphere and splash down. It is just an incredibly thrilling, momentum-driven pace from start to finish.
Now, I want to zoom in on that 10-minute window between minutes 17 and 27, because what SpaceX is doing here is honestly brilliant. Step 1. The ship opens up and ejects those 22 dummy Starlink satellites into the void of space. But here's the really clever dual purpose of these dummies. Step 2. The final 2 craft that leave the ship will actively reorient themselves. Why? Well, that leads to Step 3. So their onboard cameras can actually capture crucial diagnostic imagery of the ship's heat shield from the outside. By doing this, SpaceX is testing their cargo deployment mechanisms and monitoring the health of their thermal protection tiles at the exact same time. It's a 2 birds, 1 stone situation.
And finally, part 5, splashdown and recovery. As the clock winds down, we get to examine the grand finale for both halves of this mega rocket. And this brilliantly illustrates just how far and fast these vehicles travel, because we are looking at 2 very different watery endings. The Super Heavy booster, after doing all that heavy lifting early on, will descend to a soft splashdown in the Gulf of Mexico just 7 minutes after liftoff. Meanwhile, the ship is going to coast halfway across the globe for 65 minutes, culminating in a super dramatic re-entry and splashdown in the Indian Ocean, just off the coast of Western Australia. Now, for those of you out there hoping to see Starbase's famous mechanical chopsticks catch the returning booster right out of midair, well, we need to manage expectations for this particular run. SpaceX has stated super clearly that because this is the first flight test of a significantly redesigned vehicle, the booster will not attempt to return to the launch site for a catch. And honestly, they're playing it smart here. Rather than risking their launch infrastructure on an untested V3 architecture, they're going to gather pristine flight data from a controlled ocean splashdown instead. And really, that brings us to the ultimate purpose of this May 19th launch. Every single clean sheet redesign, every resized grid fin, and every simulated satellite deployment is built to gather the exact data needed for the next giant leap. Which leaves us with this final provocative thought. How will this single 65-minute test flight permanently alter the timeline for humanity reaching Mars? With the V3 architecture finally taking to the skies, that timeline might be accelerating a whole lot faster than we ever imagined. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and definitely keep your eyes on the skies.